Look around you for a moment: the price of your food, the rent you pay, the cost of fuel, the value of your salary. Most people believe these prices are decided by the free market supply and demand. But what if that isn't the full story? What if a small group of financial institutions, operating mostly out of public view, quietly influence the price of almost everything in the economy? Not by directly setting prices, but by controlling something far more powerful: money itself. Because when you control the supply of money, you influence the price of every asset, every product, and every wage. This is the hidden story of central banks and how they quietly shape the economic reality of billions of people. To understand this system, we have to go back several centuries. Before modern central banks existed, economies ran on gold and silver. Money had a physical limit because it was tied to real metals. Governments couldn't just create new money out of thin air, but this created a problem. When wars happened, governments needed massive amounts of money quickly, far more than their gold reserves allowed. So, rulers turned to private bankers. These bankers would lend money to governments, often at high interest. Over time, a new idea emerged. Instead of governments borrowing directly from private banks, they could create central banks, institutions with special powers to manage a nation's money supply. One of the earliest examples was the Bank of England in 1694. Its job was simple on the surface: help the government manage debt and stabilize the financial system. But this small innovation would slowly reshape the entire global economy. Because once an institution gains the power to create money and influence interest rates, it gains enormous influence over everything. Fast forward to the 20th century. The global economy was becoming more complex. Banking crises were common. Financial panics could collapse entire economies overnight. In response, many countries created powerful central banks. One of the most important was the Federal Reserve. Established in the United States in 1913, the official goal was stability: prevent bank failures, control inflation, and keep the economy growing. But central banks had a powerful new tool: interest rates. By raising or lowering interest rates, central banks could influence borrowing across the entire economy. When interest rates fall, loans become cheaper. Businesses borrow more, consumers spend more, and asset prices rise. When interest rates rise, borrowing slows, spending drops, and markets cool down. This might sound simple, but these small changes ripple through the entire economy. Interest rates affect mortgage payments, business investment, stock market valuations, government debt costs, and currency values. In other words, interest rates quietly shape the price of almost everything. For much of history, money was tied to gold. This limited how much governments and central banks could expand the money supply. But that changed dramatically in 1971. That year, the United States ended the gold standard. For the first time in modern history, the global financial system was no longer tied to a physical asset. Money became purely fiat, created by government decree. This moment changed everything. Because now, central banks could expand the money supply far more easily. They didn't need gold, they just needed policy decisions. Over the next few decades, this power would grow. Whenever a financial crisis appeared, central banks stepped in. They lowered interest rates, injected liquidity, and expanded the money supply. At first, these actions seemed temporary. But over time, they became a permanent feature of the global economy. Here's where the story becomes more complicated. When central banks lower interest rates and expand the money supply, the goal is to stimulate the economy. But the effects are uneven. New money doesn't enter the economy evenly. It enters through the financial system first. Banks, financial institutions, and large corporations gain access to cheap credit before the rest of society. This creates a phenomenon economists call asset inflation. Stocks rise, real estate prices surge, and financial assets grow dramatically. But wages often grow much more slowly. Over time, this creates a widening gap. Those who own assets benefit the most, while those who rely on wages struggle to keep up. In many countries today, housing prices have increased far faster than incomes, and stock markets have reached record highs. Meanwhile, many people feel that everyday life is becoming more expensive: food, energy, rent, healthcare. These rising costs are often blamed on supply shortages or market forces, but the underlying driver is frequently monetary expansion. When the supply of money grows faster than the supply of goods, prices rise. Not just in one industry, but across the entire economy. The power of central banks became even more visible after the 2008 global financial crisis. When banks collapsed and markets crashed, central banks stepped in with an unprecedented policy: quantitative easing. Instead of just lowering interest rates, central banks began buying massive amounts of financial assets, including government bonds. This injected trillions of dollars into financial markets. The goal was to prevent economic collapse, and in many ways, it worked, but it also created new consequences. Asset prices exploded, stock markets reached historic highs, and housing markets surged. Debt levels increased dramatically. Global debt today is estimated at over $300 trillion. That is more than 3 times the size of the entire global economy. This raises a difficult question. If so much of the global economy now depends on low interest rates and constant liquidity, what happens if that support disappears? Central banks now face a difficult balancing act. If they raise interest rates too quickly, they risk triggering financial crises. But if they keep rates too low for too long, they risk fueling inflation and asset bubbles. This cycle has repeated many times. A financial crisis occurs. Central banks inject liquidity, asset prices rise, debt increases, new instability appears, and then another intervention begins. Each cycle becomes larger than the last, with more money, more debt, and more dependence on central bank policies. The system becomes harder to unwind because modern economies are now deeply tied to cheap credit and continuous monetary expansion. Today, central banks influence the global economy in ways most people rarely think about. A small interest rate change can move trillions of dollars across markets. It can change housing affordability, stock market valuations, government budgets, business investment, and currency strength. These decisions are made by relatively small committees inside central banks. Their goal is stability, but their influence reaches every corner of the economy. From the cost of groceries to the price of homes to the value of retirement savings. In many ways, central banks do not directly control prices, but by controlling the cost of money, they shape the environment where prices are formed. And that influence is enormous. So, what does this all mean? Here are 3 important takeaways. First, central banks rarely set prices directly, but by controlling interest rates and the money supply, they influence the price of nearly everything. Second, monetary expansion tends to inflate financial assets first, which can increase wealth inequality over time. Those closest to financial markets benefit the most. And third, modern economies have become deeply dependent on central bank intervention. This creates stability in the short term, but long-term risks remain. The biggest question is not whether central banks influence the economy; they clearly do. The real question is how much control should any institution have over the price of money itself. Because when the price of money changes, the price of everything else eventually follows. If you found this breakdown helpful, subscribe to the channel, because in the next episode, we explore another hidden piece of the financial system: how global debt became the most profitable product in modern history.